Palworld was never just Pokemon with guns, and I kind of knew that before I even played it because I played their previous game, Craftopia, a whole bunch, but somehow years later, the Pokemon comparison is like one of the only conversations most people will have about this game. And Craftopia leading into them developing Palworld kind of made sense because Craftopia was kind of like a survival sandbox that was spoofing Zelda Breath of the Wild at the time. And while it doesn't hold a candle to Zelda Breath of the Wild in any shape or form, on a conceptual level, it is a really interesting game with a lot of features. But my mixed feelings about that game made me kind of just unenthused about Palworld's release. I knew what Pocketpair's games felt like, and I knew they liked taking survival systems, crafting, automation, and exploration, and throwing a bunch of random features on top and just kind of seeing what sticks. Craftopia was messy, ambitious, and kind of just held together with what felt like digital tape, and it was full of systems that seemed to exist because someone at Pocketpair had an idea and nobody just stopped them. Really, both of these games kind of fell into the same issues that I have with something like No Man's Sky. All of them are great games, but with all the features coupled together and not a lot of things connecting, it kind of gives you that feeling of as wide as an ocean, but as deep as a puddle. And that's what makes these games all kind of share this interesting trait of they were all very good games that kind of just left you wanting more and more and more, no matter how much they added. That being said, when Palworld first appeared, I didn't see it as a random Pokemon competitor or some kind of knockoff that somehow wandered into a survival game. I saw it as Pocketpair making another Pocketpair game. Palworld and Craftopia do share a lot of systems and mechanics, and when the game released, I was looking forward to a more focused and polished game. This was kind of their proving ground to really take all those systems and mechanics they experimented with and really polish them and try to make something a little more whole. Now, my focus on the gameplay itself does not really mean I thought the Pokemon comparison was ridiculous. Obviously, it's fucking Pokemon, okay? I understand. I've seen the game, I've played it. And if you look at Palworld for 5 minutes, you understand why people make that comparison. The problem was that everyone just kind of stopped there. And the comparison obviously isn't invented just out of thin air. Palworld has creatures that you collect, you throw an object to capture them, you build a fucking team of those pals, and you use them in combat. You can even ride some of them. It carries a very similar structure to Pokemon, and I think that is most of the appeal. It being the appeal of the game, the problem was not that people noticed the similarities. The problem was that the comparison kind of just became the conclusion instead of the opening question. People went from "this reminds me of Pokemon" to like "this is Pokemon. You stole Pokemon." And that argument kind of just turns all of these gameplay mechanics and similarities into evidence for an argument. Everything now in this game goes into this same box of the creatures are not just creatures, they're evidence for this argument. The capture system is no longer just a mechanic in a much larger survival game. It is just evidence for this lawsuit. Even the fact that Palworld was popular in and of itself just became evidence that they were trying to riff on Pokemon's IP. And that kind of just removes the whole point of the game and asking what the devs of Palworld are trying to do. Instead, it turns into like asking if they're even allowed to do that. But the Pokemon comparison is pretty surface level. Pokemon kind of just explains how Palworld looks visually. Craftopia explains much more about how Palworld plays. Palworld is not built on walking through a region, collecting badges, and eventually challenging an elite group of trainers. Palworld is more so built around gathering resources, crafting tools, building a base, setting up production, exploring areas, managing your creatures. Then you use those creatures to fight, travel, work, and keep your settlement running. It shares more DNA with something like Ark Survival Evolved or Conan Exiles than it does with Pokemon in and of itself as far as the gameplay is concerned. The pals themselves aren't just members of your little battle team that you go training with. They're your workers, they're your mounts, they can be weapons, they gather resources, and they can defend your base. And sometimes they're just pretty much like your employees that get assigned to a job that they're not even necessarily qualified for, but you don't have the pal that's for that job. Hey, this is the obligatory part where I say, You should subscribe if you want more of this. If you don't want more of this, then don't subscribe. Dislike, click that ellipses, say I don't want to see this channel ever again. Get me out of your feed. If you do like it though, subscribe and watch more. We like watching more. The Pokemon with Guns description was effective because it was simple. It told people what the visual hook was pretty much immediately. And at surface level, it seemed so ridiculous and silly that it ended up being one of their best marketing ploys that they could have ever possibly come up with. And they aren't even the ones that came up with it. For some people, they kind of had that Shadow the Hedgehog moment of like, finally, Pokemon is edgy, which kind of seems goofy as shit, but if it works, I guess. For a lot of other people, it kind of just meant this is a cheap imitation of something that I love and it should not exist. Which is kind of interesting given that both sides were using the same comparison, they just reached different emotional conclusions. But neither of those first impressions really tell you what the whole game is actually about. Palworld is funny, clumsy, ambitious, repetitive, sometimes relaxing, and occasionally held together by some questionable design decisions. Which to me, that's a little bit more interesting than saying this is secretly Pokemon or this is secretly not Pokemon. The game's true identity relies on that combination of features. Creature collection is just one part of it, but survival progression is another, and base building is another. Pocketpair's particular brand of chaotic experimentation is another. And the fact that all these systems work together imperfectly is not necessarily a flaw. That's just how they make games. All of this came to a head when the lawsuit happened, and this is kind of where the conversation becomes even more complicated. And the case mostly had to do with patent claims, not a court ruling that Palworld copied Pokemon's characters. And the reported issues involved gameplay systems such as throwing a ball-like object to capture creatures. It wasn't really a direct legal ruling about the PAL designs themselves, and the case is still ongoing. That distinction to me matters the most because a lot of the public discussion tends to flatten everything down into one sentence. Nintendo is suing Palworld because it looks like Pokemon, but that's not really a complete explanation of what is even being argued legally. And realistically at this point, the lawsuit has pretty much lost any bite that it had. If Nintendo wins, they'll receive roughly $30,000 for the patent infringement itself. But honestly, given Palworld's sales, that's just a drop in the bucket for them now. Pretty much ever since the lawsuit came into the limelight, every similarity between the games became evidence and every difference became a defense. The creatures and the capture system was their evidence, and the survival mechanics and the fact that Pocketpair had already made Craftopia before became a defense. And that just stops people from talking about the game entirely, and then they just argue about whether the game's even allowed to exist. The comparisons became the trial, and that is the point where I think comparisons stop being useful. Now, I feel like my take on this particular conversation is almost irrelevant. I haven't really played much of Pokemon since Pokemon Stadium, and before that, Pokemon Gold. And when I was younger, Pokemon was not necessarily my trading card game of choice.
It's time to do.
Now, personally, I think the trial was one of the best things that could have happened to Palworld. It gave an indie game more exposure than I could have ever hoped for. It gave them mainstream media attention in the gaming sphere without spending a dime. And fortunately for them, they were competent enough to keep working on the game and making it better using the sales and attention that they had. All of this transpiring all at once propelled their game to the Mount Olympus of survival games. Which is funny because upon release, I originally wrote this game off. I felt like all it was a slightly different Craftopia. You know, I recognized all the systems, I recognized a lot of the same assets again. My original playthrough was only about maybe 6 hours. I started a new character pretty recently and I've dumped about 30 hours into the game. And you know what? It's a pretty good fucking game, guys. I'm having a good time. It has a few flaws, like the combat feels pretty shallow, and the base building is pretty fucking abysmal. It kinda sucks. What keeps roping me back in is the exploration and the creature collecting pretty much as a whole. I was wrong about this game, and I'm really glad I gave it a second chance. The Pokemon comparison's understandable, but it's only a useful argument for about 5 minutes. After that, it just kind of becomes a cage for what the game actually is. I just don't think that's the whole story, and I definitely don't think that it's the best way to understand why people play the game. So, for the sake of conversation, what game do you think is constantly discussed through the wrong lens? Not a game that you think is perfect, a game where the conversation keeps focusing on something that is not actually the reason people enjoy it. Go ahead and drop that in the comments, and like, subscribe, do all that fun shit. Until next time.